All right. All right. Well, hi, everyone. Thank you for having me and for this invitation. And I am excited to share my thoughts with you about what the real paleo diet was. Um, so the photo that you see on this opening slide is a 1950s advertisement by the American Meat Institute that is promoting eating meat as a nutritious protein option. And I like to start with this because when you hear about what the paleo diet is, like the modern diet fads, often it has to do with meat eating. So we'll talk a little bit about whether that's well supported or not. So I work at the Smithsonian at the National Museum of Natural History. I'm in the Department of Anthropology, and within that, I'm in the Human Origins Program. And a big part of what I do is research. And my central research question is really, what was the real paleo diet, kind of broadly? I am specifically interested in meat eating, and but I like this meme. There's always a meme for everything, um, and this, I think, portrays the idea that like eating some ancestral diet on its own will magically make us healthy, that our ancestors ate diets perfectly in tune with their bodies, and that they lived long, healthy lives. The rest of this meme also, um, kind of doesn't support that some of these ideas about like this wonderful, healthy diet and longevity. But let me back up and say, like, who cares? Why should we care about what our ancestors ate? And what does it tell us about the rest of their lives? Well, there are hypotheses that diets have to do with the evolution of brain size, body size, life history, meaning like over how long we it takes us to grow up and develop, habitat preferences, where early humans like to hang around, um, home range sizes, over what kind of areas were early humans foraging on a daily basis, their foraging strategies, what kinds of habitats were they in? Were they active during the day? Were they active at night? Were they, following other animals around? And kind of their activity budgets, like again, kind of time of day and things like that. And even potentially had something to do with their social organization. So you could start to paint this picture like you see. This is a National Geographic illustration of what I will sometimes call like an ancient meat picnic, of, early humans eating leftovers of animals and some eating plants and interacting and like socializing in the background and that sort of thing. So I want to have a very quick overview of the sort of meet your ancestors and some of the players on the human family tree, or the cast of characters. So this is a tree that we have in the Hall of Human Origins. If you come visit the Natural History Museum, I was on the team that helped put that exhibit together. And this is our kind of graphic. It's not a scientific family tree, but it's a graphic representation of these four different groups of early humans. And so you see, you are here at the very top. We are all members of Homo sapiens. We have been around for about 300,000 years. And we are the last species left on this family tree that used to be very diverse. And the other three groups, the one kind of towards the root of our tree is called the Ardipithecus group. And that's the oldest species. Then you'll see a little bit further up to the left is the Australopithecus group. They are probably ancestral to us, as well as that group off to the right, the Paranthropus group, which is kind of an extinct side branch. Another way of thinking about who your ancestors were are these photos of 8 reconstructed heads of different species, again, also from the Hall of Human Origins at the Natural History Museum. And this gives you a little bit of information, not quite what their names were, but their species names and where they lived and when they lived, and just gives you a little bit of the sense of like the diversity of different early humans that were around at the time. So I'll be mentioning a few of these species in different contexts during the talk. So I would say that there have been 3 really major changes in the evolution of human diets. The first one was by around 3.4 million years ago, maybe a little bit later. eating meat and marrow and other things from big animals. And that was a pretty big shift. So that family tree is rooted, our family tree is rooted at somewhere between 6 and 7 million years ago. We share a common ancestor at that root with living great apes like chimps, bonobos, gorillas, orangutans, and those we share an ancestor with a little um, later, a little earlier, sorry. But us and our closest living cousins, our living relatives, chimpanzees, share an ancestor about 6 million years ago. So for the first 3-ish million years of human evolution, our diets were probably kind of chimp-like, and I'll talk about what that means. Um, and then we have evidence that early humans started to eat meat from big animals. I think the next big shift was starting to cook food. The best solid evidence for that comes in at about 1 million years ago, I would say. Um, and then we have the domestication of plants and animals, and that starts somewhere around maybe 15,000 years ago, maybe a little bit longer ago than that. But I think these are the three biggest changes in our diets through time. Um, so what's the evidence for this? There's a lot of evidence actually. And one of the cool things I like about studying early human diets is all these different lines of evidence. This is not necessarily the evidence for early human diets, but this is the evidence that is on display in our Hall of Human Origins. Um, some of it, at least before it went on exhibit. So if I was going to give you a menu of the different kinds of evidence that researchers use to study paleo diets, here is what would be on that menu. The first is the diet of chimpanzees, because we can use them, our close cousins, as a model for what some of our earliest ancestors' diets may have been like. The second is the diets of modern human foragers and historic human foragers as another model. We can look at the early human fossils themselves. We can look at the morphology, the size and shape of things like bones and teeth and skulls. Um, and we can even look at the chemistry of some of those fossils to get a sense of different kinds of plants and maybe some animals that early humans ate. We can look at plant microfossils, and I'll talk a little bit about how that will work. We can look at archaeology, the archaeological record, the tools that early humans used and made to eat food. We can sometimes look at ancient molecules. I'll give you an example of that. And then the two things that I look at, particularly the animal fossils of animals that were eaten by early humans. And we can actually do experiments or make observations today that help us understand past processes and the results of those. So we'll go through some of these lines of evidence. What do we know about chimpanzee diets? We know that across the range of chimpanzees, kind of across equatorial Africa, they are varied and seasonal. In general, though, chimps eat mostly plants, particularly fruit, all different kinds of fruit, different parts of plants. They also quite like insects. They will eat termites, particularly when they're swarming. They will eat bees and they will eat honey ants. They'll sometimes eat birds and their eggs. They really like honey. And occasionally they will eat vertebrates. They'll eat animals. They particularly like colobus monkeys, which are smaller primates that live in the same sorts of forests where chimpanzees live. Across chimpanzee communities, vertebrates or meat make up about 3% of diets on average, and it can be varied across populations. What do we know about hunting in chimpanzees? It's infrequent, doesn't happen very often. It is seasonal, and it is expensive. And by expensive, I mean energetically expensive. Chimps expend a ton of energy when they are hunting and often have nothing to show for it at the end. As I mentioned, meat makes up about 3% of chimpanzee diets. It usually occurs in times of fruit abundance, and that's the seasonality. That's a surprising observation, especially when it was first made, because one hypothesis of why do chimps hunt is because they're hungry, maybe when fruit isn't around or their other preferred foods aren't around. But no, they hunt more often when there's a lot of fruit. And it turns out that it's very likely because there needs to be a critical mass of chimps in one place to go hunting. So it seems to really serve a social function as well as a dietary function. Their prey animals are usually small. So especially monkeys that live in the same trees that chimps do, they don't tend to eat or prey on big animals. And chimp hunting rarely involves tool use. There's only one group of chimpanzees from Senegal in West Africa that have been observed using tools to hunt. Chimps use tools for lots of things, but hunting not so much. And so this group in West Africa, um, they will break branches or sticks off of trees, sharpen them using their teeth, and then use them as spears to actually spear smaller primates called bush babies or galagos that are nocturnal. So they'll often sleep in tree hollows during the day. Interestingly, that tends to be observed more with female chimps than male chimps, although male chimps in general do more of the hunting. Scavenging is very rare in chimpanzees. Chimps don't tend to look at a dead animal and think, that's food. So that's something to think about as we continue on, because I have an interest in scavenging. So what do we know about modern hunter-gatherer diets? They are also very varied and seasonal. And I really like this graphic from, I think it was a Scientific American article that just looked at 4 different hunter-gatherer groups: the Inuit from North America, the Hiwi from South America, the Kung or the San from Southern Africa, and the Hadza from Eastern Africa. And you can see the different proportions of different types of foods in their diet. So, which is those different colored bars. So there's a little bit of milk and cornmeal, particularly in the group from Southern Africa. Seeds and nuts are very prevalent in the Kung diet in Southern Africa. Roots are much more prevalent in the Hadza diet in Eastern Africa. Fruits and vegetables tend to be present, but also in different proportions. And then meat and fish are very prevalent in Inuit diets, in Arctic areas, but also Hiwi diets in basically kind of equatorial areas in Southern Africa. So let's dive in a little bit more into one of these groups. And so this is like a pictograph of the diet of the Hiwi. And these data are from a 1990 study of about 800 Hiwi that were living in Colombia and Venezuela in savanna grassland environments. They ate mostly plants. The foods that they hunted and collected in the wild accounted for 95% of their diet. And they eat these different varieties of plants, but also a really large variety of meat, from larger animals like capybaras and peccaries, and deers and anteaters, all the way down to small things, lizards, birds, rabbits. And their hunting is very seasonal, or their animal collection also is very seasonal. So in the dry season between January and March, they were fishing, and also the fish that were trapped in pools of water that were getting smaller during the dry season would attract other predators, which they would then hunt as well. From May to November, in their long wet season, they often hunted other bigger animals with bows and arrows in the forest. Sounds like a wonderful, healthy diet, right? Well, in a comparison to a nearby hunter-gatherer group in Paraguay called the Ache, the Hiwi were described as shorter, thinner, and more malnourished, basically, or less well nourished, more lethargic. It was observed that the Hiwi men and women of all ages would constantly complain of hunger. Many of them were infected with parasitic hookworms, and only 50% of Hiwi children at that time would survive beyond the age of 15. So while this seems like a very healthy diet, there were other kind of aspects of, Kiwi lifestyles that it depends if we would call that healthy or not. So what do we know about hunting, particularly in modern hunter-gatherers? We know that the species of prey, the sizes of prey, the habitats that their prey live in, and their prey behaviors are widely varied across the globe. But we do know that modern hunter-gatherers are largely reliant on some kind of technology. So they have bows and arrows, spears, traps, fish hooks, guns where they're able to procure them. Often this hunting can be seasonal depending on the prey that they're hunting. It is usually gender and age based, not exclusively. So like in Australia, women do particularly a lot of hunting of smaller animals. Often in these groups, the men will do hunting of the larger animals, particularly sort of like, older men or kind of men in their prime. And it can involve scavenging. That group, the Hadza in Eastern Africa, can sometimes get up to 25% of the meat that they eat scavenging from lion kills and things like that. So what do we know from early human fossils? We can look at morphology, which I mentioned is the size and shape of bones. So you can see in that top left picture, there's a modern human skull on the right, and then there's a skull of that group called Paranthropus on the left. Paranthropus teeth were about 3 times the size of ours, and they had very thick enamel. They were doing a lot of chewing with their teeth. So we can look at the size and shape of teeth to get a sense of like, are they spending a lot of time chewing and chewing and chewing? We can look at the size and shape of their jaws. We can also look at the thickness of tooth enamel. So animals that we think of today, like cows and horses and other animals that spend a lot of time chewing, have very thick enamel so that it can resist all that grinding. And then we can look at things like the sizes of muscle attachments on different parts of their skulls and jaws. So that bottom image, you can see a pointer to something called a sagittal crest. And that, if you were to put your hands on top of your head, kind of at your temples, and you chew, you feel chewing muscles, I should hope. If you put your hands up here on the top of your head, you do not feel chewing muscles if you do that. If you were a paranthropus, you would feel chewing muscles all the way up there. So that thing that looks like a bone mohawk is basically the place where these big chewing muscles attach to the top of their skull because they probably spent so much time chewing. So all of those clues can help us understand basically how much time, how much force is resistant in all of that time spent chewing. I won't get super into the chemistry that some researchers use, although it's a wonderful tool that we can use to understand these diets. The two systems that tend to be used are the carbon isotope system and the nitrogen isotope system. The way that carbon isotopes work are that during photosynthesis, plants take in carbon dioxide and they convert it to sugars. And there's two pathways that plants tend to use to do that. One is the C3 pathway, and those are things with leaves like trees and shrubs and herbs, sometimes some grasses. And then there's the C4 pathway, and that tends to be things like grasses and sedges in the tropics. So we can actually look at the chemistry in fossil bones and teeth and get a sense of what types of plants early humans ate, the leafy plants or the more grassy ones. Nitrogen isotopes work a little bit differently. As organisms eat each other, there's a isotope of nitrogen, nitrogen 15, that sort of gets transferred up the food chain to the predators. So organisms higher in the trophic level have higher levels of nitrogen 15 relative to prey and others further down in the food web. So what do we see in early human fossils? We see basically, and this is kind of a graph that has carbon isotope data. We see that at 4.4 million years, there's a species called Ardipithecus, part of that earliest group. They had a mostly C3 diet, so eating a lot of leafy plants. By 3.5 million years ago, you have some species that are starting to incorporate more grassy plants, more C4 plants into their diet. You can see that in the pink dots. By about 2.5 million years ago, diets of that group Paranthropus were more specialized in C4. So they're eating a lot of grass, makes sense, sort of grinding, and their thick enamel and their big jaws and muscle attachments and big teeth. So this seems like a trend. But then interestingly, there's a species called Australopithecus sediba from Southern Africa that at 2 million years ago kind of has that C3 diet back to those leafy plants. So that gives us a sense that really it's probably more of just the local habitats that those species are adapted to, the types of plants that they were eating. So yeah, so basically all the way back here with Australopithecus sediba. So here's an example of nitrogen isotopes. So I mentioned that nitrogen 15 isotopes are transferred up the food chain to predators. This is a lovely reconstruction of Neanderthals hunting woolly mammoth. So the nitrogen isotope data support the idea that Neanderthals were big hunters. They tend to have the same nitrogen isotope levels as other top level carnivores found in the same fossil assemblages that they were. They seem to have obtained almost all of their dietary protein from large terrestrial herbivores. And I have a little asterisk at that terrestrial because Neanderthals, which lived in Europe and Western Asia during ice ages between about 400,000 and 40,000 years ago, the ones that lived along the southern coast in places like Spain, France, and even Portugal sometimes actually got their protein from marine sources. And Neanderthal values are pretty similar through time. So this seems to be a consistent adaptation to eating a lot of meat in Neanderthals. So I mentioned plant microfossils. So plant structures have silica in them, and after the plants decay, the silica is redeposited in the soil in the form of something called phytoliths. This is a Greek word meaning plant stone. These are rigid microscopic structures, which you see on the left, that can be varied in sizes and shape. And you can actually find them sticking to the surfaces of the teeth of early humans. So I mentioned what these silica were. Sometimes they're phytoliths or starch grains. They get trapped. Thankfully, there are no Pleistocene or Paleolithic toothbrushes because they're basically trapped in the dental calculus of early humans on their teeth. And Australopithecus sediba, who I mentioned before, that had that C3 diet, they, based on the phytoliths on their teeth, they actually had a very varied diet. It included plants, including fruit, leaves, and even wood or bark. Seems very strange. I still think that's a bit of a mystery. And Neanderthals, though, who have this reputation for being great hunters, also ate a lot of fruit and a lot of plants. They ate date palm fruits, they ate legumes, they ate water lily tubers, according to actually the starch grain stuck on their teeth, and they even cooked some of the plants that they ate. So that bottom right picture is a cooked grain, very similar to barley. And you could tell when the starches have been cooked because they have a different shape after cooking. So really cool research, different lines of evidence giving us a more holistic picture, I think. So a more recent research that was published in 2022 looked at some very early modern humans in China. And they looked at a whole bunch of different varieties of starch grains on their teeth. These are dated between about 120,000 and 80,000 years ago. Starch grains related to acorns, roots and tubers, or otherwise known as USOs, or underground storage organs, grasses, at least sort of progenitors or species similar to wheat, barley, and rye. Also, other grasses like maize, rice, millet, and bamboo, kind of they're similar wild relatives. Oops. Let me go back to there for a second. Very interesting. They also found some conifer wood fragments on specific places on some of their teeth, and they think it may be evidence of toothpicks, of basically like, trying to get some of the food out of your teeth with using specific conifer wood toothpicks. So I thought that was pretty cool. I want to talk about grains a little bit. So, the paleo diet, modern paleo diet idea is often it includes the idea that people didn't eat grains until very recently, and we are not well adapted to eating things like grains. So let me talk about some of the earliest evidence for grain eating. And this is evidence from a site called Ohalo-2 in Israel, dated to about 23,000 years ago. The staple foods of this forager group were wild wheat and barley. This site was found in 1989, and they found tens of thousands of seeds and fruit representing almost 100 different plant species. This grinding stone here, particularly, was covered with barley starch grains. They found evidence of wheat and oats on the surface. And basically, it looked like this wild emmer wheat and barley was baked in sort of an oven-like hearth. So I sometimes call these paleo pitas that people were making more than 20,000 years ago. They also found wild almonds, olives, pistachios, and grapes. And it seems like there was this routine processing of wild cereals before they were domesticated in Southwest Asia. Also, fun fact, this site also has some of the oldest evidence of string making in the form of fibers that were kind of twisted together. So now I'm going to shift to meat eating because this is really my area of expertise and interest. And what makes early human carnivory? And so I use that instead of just meat eating because I think early humans were eating other things other than meat from the animals that they were eating from. So what makes it unique compared to the carnivory practiced by chimpanzees, our closest living relatives? The use of tools. So this reconstruction is of a butchery site at a site in southern Kenya called Olorgesailie. It's a Smithsonian research site where I've also done some studies. And these early humans are using tools. So you saw the teeth of that Paranthropus. They might be good for grinding, probably not good for doing things like what carnivores do, is actually getting into skins and being able to get into an animal. So tool use is probably important. We also see big animals. So as soon as we see evidence in the archaeological record, which I'll show you, for early humans butchering animals, they're big. They're animals much bigger than themselves, very different than chimpanzees. We also have evidence for what we call deferred consumption. And basically what that means is when we go grocery shopping, we walk around the store with a cart. We don't sit down on the floor and open the packages and eat all the food, I hope. So even when we see the earliest evidence of meat eating, early humans were not eating the animal tissues just as they found them. They would often bring them back to a central place, sometimes maybe store them for later use, and not eat things as they encountered them right away. And I think we see good evidence for scavenging in the beginning of the meat eating history of early humans. So, what is this evidence? Basically, it looks like this. And so I spend a lot of my time with a hand lens looking at fossil bones, looking for that picture on the top. I look for cut marks, which are the trace fossils, essentially, of early humans using sharp stone knives or stone tools to slice meat off of bones. Or there's other marks called percussion marks, where humans bashed open bones to get at fat-rich marrow. The archaeological record, hugely important in understanding meat eating. And I really like this quote from a book called The Omnivorous Mind, Our Evolving Relationship with Food by John Allen from 2012. That says the evidence of meat eating signals the development of a technologically based omnivory, rather than one based on expanding food resources through specialized anatomical features. That means our teeth are wimpy. We need tools in order to be able to get inside of animal carcasses. There was a really fun study that was published in 2016 by Catherine Zink and Dan Lieberman at Harvard University, where they did an experiment with modern people eating roots, including carrots, beets, and yams, and goat meat raw. They also they ate this meat in big chunks. They chopped it up, they pounded it, and they cooked it. They attached electrodes to volunteers' faces to measure the activity of their chewing muscles, and they would chew each piece of food until they were about to swallow, and then they would spit it out. They spread the food particles on a tray, they photographed them, they measured how big they were, and they basically saw how much energy was expended through this chewing. And they calculated that on a diet of 2,000 calories a day, if about a third of those calories were from meat and 2/3 were from roots, if you just sliced the meat and pounded the roots, early humans would have chewed 2.5 million times less per year just from basic processing of food. They would have spent 17% less time chewing. That's sort of an entire month that they would spend not having to chew just by virtue of having these basic tools. They would use 20% less force per year. The meat particles would be 41% smaller, much easier to digest. So like in comparison, chimpanzees often spend 5 to 11 hours to chew animals when they're eating meat. So this would be a really big difference. And so yes, this is about tools, not teeth. So I'm going to take you through a whirlwind tour of the archaeological record and what it tells us about, eating different kinds of meat and animal resources. So by about 3.3 million years ago, we have the oldest stone tools. These are from a site in Kenya. They're simple flakes and cores, which you can see on the top left. Most of this starting at about 2.6 million years ago is called Oldowan technology. And then we see the earliest hunting technology in the form of spear points at about 500,000 years ago. And this is from a site called Katupan in Southern Africa. So we have a lot of food processing technology, but we don't really have hunting technology until about 500,000 years ago. We have wooden spears, uniquely, amazingly preserved wooden spears from a site in Germany dating to about 400,000 years ago. Then we start to see an expansion of diet, things like shellfish eating by about 164,000 years ago. The bottom left, you see these amazing barbed bone harpoon points, definitely indicating fishing, found with thousands of fish fossils dating to about 77,000 years ago. We see the evidence of roasting snails at a site in eastern Spain at about 30,000 years ago. Um, and then we start to see other forms of technology, even outside of things like made from stone and bone. So we see baskets by about 26,000 years ago. And it's not the plant fibers themselves that preserve, but it's actually impressions on sort of hardened clay from the plant fibers that have now disintegrated, which I think is pretty cool. And then we see things like storage in the form of pottery back to about 20,000 years ago. All of these things highlighted in red are associated with our species, with Homo sapiens. So there's been a real explosion of technology related to making tools for specific purposes later in time. I mentioned ancient animal proteins, and I love this example. This is a phenomenal study, and this was a study published in 2016, led by April Noel of the University of Victoria in Canada. Her team excavated over 10,000 stone tools over 3 years from a site called Sishan Marsh in ancient Jordan, dated to about 250,000 years ago. And you can see this little maybe red square up there. They were looking at the edges of tools, testing for protein residues, blood protein, and other animal tissues. They tested 44 tools that they thought were good candidates, and 17 of them tested positive for these protein residues. And at this point, these were the world's oldest identified blood proteins. Of the tools, 3 of them tested positive for rhino blood, 5 for horse, 3 for wild cattle, 3 for camels, and 3 for duck. And what I think is really interesting is that each tool only had one type of blood protein on it. And this, I think, is strong support for the idea that these tools were really used to butcher these animals. They didn't just sort of get blood on them from sitting in the sediment somehow. So really good, like direct evidence of the tools being used to butcher specific animals. So I mentioned cut marks before, and you saw that photo. That was from some of my dissertation research at a site in northern Kenya. So I use a tool called taphonomy to study animal fossils. And that's basically the whole of taphonomy is what happens to an organism after death through its discovery. And this is a cool illustration of a possible taphonomic scenario resulting in the accumulation of giant panda bones in a cave in China. I swear I did not put this in just because of the pandas that just came to the National Zoo. So the sort of the time interval that I'm interested in is kind of in the middle bars between block number 3 and block number 4, between the organism dying and between it kind of becoming a skeleton. And the way that I investigate this is I look for those butchery marks left by early humans from skinning carcasses, taking the flesh off, disarticulating them and pulling them apart, and those percussion marks left from bashing bones to get at marrow. So what do we know based on this record? We know that before 2 million years ago, early humans were occasionally eating meat. We have evidence for sites like Dakika in Ethiopia on the left. Maybe those are cut marks dating to about 3.3, 3.4 million years ago. Last year or the year before, very recently, there was this site called Nyanga in Kenya, which you see in the middle. New evidence for early butchery of hippos and antelopes. Dating to about 2.9 million years ago. And then we have a few other sites in Ethiopia, including Bori, that were dated to about 2.5 million years ago, where we have like a handful of fossils with butchery marks. So it seems like before about 2 million years ago, you have butchery here, butchery there, but it's not something that's really constant that you see in the fossil record. There seems to be this shift at about 2 million years ago. The best evidence for this comes from a site called Kangera in Western Kenya, and I've studied some of the fossils from Kangera. At Kangera, there's evidence for hundreds of butchery marked animal bones from 3 different layers at this site. And that gives us a sense, because these fossils are in 3 different layers, that might span up to about 1,000 years. that early humans were butchering animals. They were bringing multiple animals to this one place to butcher over and over again. So we called this persistent carnivory, that this is a more persistent kind of behavior. And this gives us a sense that this part of the diet was becoming more important, or at least more common. We see by about 1.95 million years ago, a little bit later than that, that early humans are expanding to butcher aquatic resources. So there are fossils from a site called Kubifora in northern Kenya with cut marks on things like turtles and crocodiles and fish. So not just terrestrial animals, but also aquatic animals by somewhere between 1.8 to 1.5 million years ago. And this is from some of my research. There's evidence for another shift where there are sites with hundreds of butchered bones. And it looks like early humans are starting to get more control of carcasses. They have early access. They're getting there before other predators. And they were probably able to basically eat from the meatier parts of animals. So as I mentioned before, and I guess I sort of gave this one away, you might be thinking, great, during all this time, early humans are hunting. This is a wonderful bronze sculpture of a species called Homo erectus from the Hall of Human Origins. She's carrying a carcass on her back. Maybe she's gone and hunted this. But I mentioned that this site called Katupan in South Africa is really, at only 500,000 years ago, the best evidence for hunting technology. And the tips of those tools have what are called diagnostic impact fractures. So we can tell based on experiments that they were actually used for hunting, probably on the ends of thrusting spears as opposed to throwing spears. So it doesn't seem like early humans were hunting until about this time. So if they were scavenging, what did that look like? How did our ancestors get that meat? There's a couple different ideas. One is the idea of passive scavenging. Wait until predators are completely finished eating, go in and get what's left over. And, early ideas of this propose that there wouldn't be much left. Another form of scavenging is called confrontational scavenging or aggressive scavenging. And this would be chasing predators off of kills. Sometimes it did not end well for early humans. We do have early humans with bite marks in the early human fossils themselves. So this would have been a dangerous proposition. And then there was hunting. But as I mentioned, if we didn't have hunting tools until about 500,000 years ago, I don't think that was a really big part of our ancestral meat eating, deep ancestral meat eating. So I wanted to see if passive scavenging was worth it and if there would really be anything left. And this is research I did that was published in 2015. I spent 7 months in a wildlife conservancy in Kenya called Alpejita Conservancy. So it's very similar to a national park. It just isn't kind of government run. And I simulated passive scavenging. I waited until predators were left and went in to see how much was left over. And this is a little bit of a different ecosystem than some previous scavenging studies. So what did I do and how did I do it? So I would find out about a carnivore kill. This is one of my favorite photos of lions eating zebras, which is what I spent a lot of my time watching. I would wait until the lions were completely finished. That photo is of a pair of 2 young male lions that would often hunt together. This time they were just lying in the road, basically not letting me drive anywhere. And this one had a big belly full of warthog. But I would go to the kills and I would document what was left. And then actually I would pick the rest of the kill up, put it into the back of my 4-wheel drive Land Cruiser because I was doing a whole separate study on what does it look like when different predators chew on bones. So I would bring them back to the research center where I was staying, get the bones cleaned off, and I was able to study them to look for different chewing patterns. I always had an armed guard with me. I should say I really did not want to become one of my own scavenging samples. So what did I find? Over the time that I was there, I collected 24 kill samples from these different species of carnivores: lions, hyenas, leopards, cheetahs, and jackals, and sometimes lions first and then hyenas would come in afterwards. And I separated the prey into 2 sizes that we use in the archaeological record, kind of larger prey over 250 pounds, things like zebra, larger antelope like eland, and then smaller prey less than 250 pounds, smaller antelope, warthog, and baboon, although I didn't have any baboon kills, but they would have gone into the small category. So let's just talk about the lion kills. That's really my biggest sample. And I separated the amount of leftover flesh into bulk flesh and flesh scraps. And this was actually using previous researchers' definitions. Bulk flesh means there's muscle masses larger than 10% of their original size. Flesh scraps are less than the size of the palm of your hand, over 2 to 3 centimeters, weighing more than about a third of a pound. So, like little bits that might be still worth going after. So, what did I find? I'm going to walk you through these axes before I actually show you the data. Um, on the y-axis is the proportion of flesh available from each of these different bones, basically, which is on the x-axis. The first two groups are the femur and tibia, the hind limb bones, and then we have 3 forelimb bones, and then we have 4 bones of the torso, and then basically 3 bones of the head. So, and the data are all color coded like a stoplight. Red, no flesh, nothing worth going after. Yellow means flesh scraps, and green means bulk flesh. So, what did I find? From large prey, from zebras and eland, I found a lot of flesh. So, about 50% of bones, a little more, were abandoned with big muscle masses still attached to them with bulk flesh. And if you include the flesh scraps, 95% of bones had some kind of flesh left on them. So there's a lot left from big animals. Smaller prey, though, same axes, different data. From smaller animals, lions do not leave a lot left over. About half the bones had some flesh scraps on them, and about half of them were fully defleshed. So, a big important message from this is that if you are an early human scavenger, the size of prey that you're scavenging makes a really big difference. How do we quantify this, though? How much meat could a scavenger eat? So, we'll take common animals in the African savanna, a wildebeest and a zebra. If you had a fully fleshed hind limb from both of these animals, from a wildebeest, you're talking about 19 pounds. From a zebra, it could be up to 50 pounds. Defleshed, maybe 2 pounds from a wildebeest and 5 pounds from a zebra. A whole carcass, though, if it still had flesh scraps, you could get 12 pounds of meat from a wildebeest and up to 34 pounds of meat from a zebra. So that's about 2,200 calories of meat from a defleshed wildebeest and over 6,000 calories from a defleshed zebra. How does that translate for us? If we're just talking about Five Guys burger patties, you get 10 of those from a wildebeest and almost 28 from a zebra. So I do think that even without breaking open bones to get at the marrow, which would have had lots of fat and calories, I think scavenging from even carcasses that don't have a lot of big muscle left is probably a profitable activity. And how does that relate to the past? So Homo erectus, that beautiful bronze sculpture carrying her kill somewhere, they are estimated to have a daily caloric requirement of somewhere between about 2,100 and 2,300 calories. One defleshed wildebeest could potentially feed a Homo erectus for a day. So I'm going to wrap up and make sure to leave some time for questions. So what do we really know about ancestral diets? And I've really just given you sort of a taste here or there. We know that dietary evolution was not linear, either within species or between species. You certainly saw that from the carbon isotopes. We know that early humans started eating meat about 3.4 million years ago, but that even our most sort of meat-loving evolutionary cousins, the Neanderthals, also ate a diversity of plants. So using these different lines of evidence paints this fuller picture. We know that early modern humans increased their diet breadth, and that's something that may have made us particularly successful. So we see that in the plant microfossil record. We see that in other kinds of records. We see that in the archaeological record. We know that grinding grain goes back to at least 30,000 years ago. I talked to you about one site dated back to about 23,000 years ago. So eating grains is something pretty ancestral to us, to Homo sapiens. And I would say that there really was no single paleo diet. Our ancestors ate kind of in sync with their local environments. Diets were probably local, seasonal, and versatile in time and space. But what do we not know? And I think what are the questions that really I'm particularly interested in? what are the proportions or quantities of different types of foods in these paleo diets, meats, plants, insects? Much harder to find evidence for that in the fossil record. And how can we find those lines of evidence? And I also think there's questions about the links between any of these ancient diets and causes of mortality. I'm happy to answer questions, although that's not my area of expertise. I think it's a really interesting line of study. Okay, so we always have to end with some kind of cartoon, right? So I'm ending with this cartoon where early people are saying they're thinking of converting to the 20th century diet. I heard they can live up to 100. So I will pause there. And I see there's questions already. Question from Steve: is there evidence for cannibalism among early humans? There is. And actually, I had a paper published last year that got a ton of press because it was evidence for early cannibalism, which I found by accident. And I'll see if I can find, actually, I will stop my screen share unless we need to go back to um, slides for any particular reasons. It's a little easier for me to see folks this way. Move this over here. So yes, there is evidence for cannibalism. It's not common, and there's more evidence for cannibalism in certain species. So there is pretty decent evidence for cannibalism in Neanderthals. In other species, it's a little bit more scattered. I will find a link to that study that I mentioned that I did and put it in the chat. And then I'll tell you how I found that evidence. Like I said, it was kind of an accident. Make sure to find one that's here's the Smithsonian Magazine coverage of it. I'll put that in the chat if anybody wants to read it later. And so I'll tell you about the cannibalism, and then I'm going to get to the two other questions and any more that come in. I was looking at early human fossils themselves. I usually just look at the animal fossils, but I was studying early human fossils because I was interested in who ate our ancestors. So I was looking at original early human fossils in the National Museums of Kenya in Nairobi, in the Fossil Vault, which is a really magical place. And I was getting a little disappointed because I wasn't really finding any evidence of carnivore bite marks. And I thought, well, this study is going to be, nothing worth publishing. And then I looked at a leg bone, just an isolated leg bone. It was found one shin bone, basically between your knee and your ankle, that was picked up on the surface by Mary Leakey in 1970. And I look over all the surfaces of the bones to look for these tooth marks. And I turned the bone over, and there were butchery marks. And I thought, no way. So anybody, other researchers who were in the museum, I sort of invited them in to say, like, does this look like what I think it looks like? And so this fossil is dated about almost 1.5 million years old. It's from probably an early Homo. I mean, from like part of a leg bone, it's really hard to say exactly what species it's from, but could be Homo erectus. And it has butchery marks that looked like the butchery marks I saw on hundreds of other fossil bones from the same time and place in northern Kenya. So some of the earliest evidence potentially for cannibalism, assuming that that's the reason why early humans were cutting meat off of this other early human leg bone. Yeah, good question by Debbie. Does the amount of protein help brain development? There is a hypothesis called the expensive tissue hypothesis. That's the idea that our brains are very energetically expensive. They are 2% of our body weight, take up 20% of our energy. As babies, they take up like 65% of our energy. And there's the idea that, like, how did our huge brains evolve? So it's very energetically expensive. And the idea is that the other very energetically expensive tissue in our bodies are our gut tissue, our digestive tissue. So we see a change in body shape over time, going from sort of like bigger chimpanzee guts to smaller modern human guts, along with this big increase in brain size. And there's the idea that there had to be some high quality protein source in order for that larger brain to evolve. And the idea of that has long been it was meat. The timing doesn't work very well, though. So we see the biggest increase in brain size in human evolutionary history compared to body size. So in the beginning, it was brain size and body size and brain size and body size kind of increasing together. At about 1 million years ago, you get pretty modern human body size and shape, and brain size really ticks up at about 1 million years ago. Meat eating, 3.3 million years ago. So meat eating seems to have started a lot earlier than that big increase in brain size from an evolutionary perspective. Maybe it's cooking because we see the best evidence for cooking at that time. And like as far as sort of brain development in people today within a lifespan, I would say, like I always say, I'm not a nutritionist or a dietitian, so I can't answer those sorts of questions. And the question that you asked, Richard, the second question about are any food types advantageous to living longer? That's another one that I would say, not my scientific lane to swim in. And there are probably food types that are not advantageous to living longer. But I would say that would not be my area of expertise. And do we know what average age that older Homo sapiens lived? That's a really good question, and one that I actually want to look more into. it's it can be difficult to get a sense of the age at death in some like much earlier fossil species. We don't have a sense that Neanderthals or even very early Homo sapiens lived much past sort of average age of menopause, 50, 60, something like that. Like you were old if you got to that age, if you were a Neanderthal or an early modern human. Um, it really isn't until, the advent of agriculture that we see like, I think, big increases in lifespan. So that's about as well as I can answer that question at this point. But I think it's a really interesting question that I want to do a little bit more digging into.
Do we know, or is there any way to know cause and effect in terms of the tools developing in conjunction with, like, were the tools designed for hunting or were they
Yeah,
made for some other purpose and then adapted?
that's a great question. And I don't think we can know with real certainty that sort of cause and effect, like whether tools were specifically made for something. So I showed you a photo of Oldowan tools, which is that basic core and flake technology. The next innovation in stone tool technology are tools called Acheulean. So the Oldowan technology lasted for 1 million years, pretty much unchanged. Um, and then Acheulean tools are hand axes and other things that are kind of teardrop shaped. They are bifacially flaked tools, so they are flaked on two faces of the core. Um, and that those tools seem to be a really good way to get more flakes out of your core. You're efficiently using your rock raw material. But what were those hand axes or those flakes used for? Even in the beginning of technology, probably used for scraping things, whittling wood, sharpening sticks, maybe digging, slicing meat off of bones. So the less specific your tool is, I think the harder it is to get a sense that we know specifically what it was made for. And we in our exhibit in the Natural History Museum call hand axes the Swiss Army knives of the Paleolithic because they probably could have been used for lots of things. We can tell sometimes you can see like starch grains around the edges of tools, and so we're like, okay, those were probably used for processing plants, but it doesn't mean that they weren't used for something else or made for one thing and used for other things. So, yeah, I think that can be really tricky.
Got it. Another thing I was wondering when you were talking about the scavenging and the amount of protein that one could get for scavenging, the number of Five Guys burgers, which is hilarious. But does that take into account? I'm sure there's a lot of competition, and so there's like
Yes.
other animals trying to take, like
Yep.
crows are coming at you and trying to get it. Was that how much of an effect do you think that would have?
That's a really good question. I think it really depended on what ecosystem you were in and what other predators were around. I just finished writing a book chapter that was basically a review of early scavenging, so not early, but like, sort of scavenging studies to date. And it was really interesting looking at pretty much all of the studies, like depending on what environment you were in, there was something left over. But in environments where there was like really intense competition with lions and hyenas, you're going to have less left. During different times of the year, you're going to have less left. in places so the picture in back of me is a picture from Ol Pejeta Conservancy in Kenya, where I did that scavenging study, and I have another long-term study going on. And at Ol Pejeta, I was super ready to, like my PhD advisor who had done a scavenging study, to follow the vultures around, and they're, circling vultures will tell me where the carcasses were. Well, it turns out, so when I did my research there, this was a small 100 square kilometer game reserve called Sweetwater's Reserve, in like next to a big cattle ranch. Um, and so the cattle were slaughtered on the cattle ranch, and all the vultures would hang around where the cattle were slaughtered. So I went, okay, now I have to, have another strategy of how I'm going to find um, these carcasses. So, but yes, I mean, in places with a lot of, like, a very packed carnivore guild with lots of different carnivore species and many individuals, you get, like, there will be a wildebeest carcass will disappear in the Serengeti in 2 hours, because lions will eat it and hyenas will eat it and things like that. So this is a, very competitive predator ecosystem in Tanzania. But in the ecosystem where I worked, and I particularly was interested in doing my research there because it was very lion dominated, but there were not a lot of hyenas, you got carcasses lasting a much longer time. And interestingly, I think it was a good model for some prehistoric ecosystems, because while in the past couple of million years you have lions, leopards, hyenas like you do today, there were also saber-toothed cats, which we do not have today. And they are reconstructed, most of them, to be real flesh specialists, but not really doing a lot of bone cracking and crunching. And so if you have a lot of flesh specialists around, you might have a lot of carcasses with a lot of flesh left if they were not completely consuming their carcasses.
Got it. Wow, thank you. That was super interesting. I learned a lot from that.
Oh, thank you.
It's just about 8 o'clock, so maybe we have time for like one more question, if there's any more, or we can wrap things up. Going once, going twice. Dr. Briana Pobiner from the Smithsonian, thank you so much once again. Everybody join us next month in November. We have a talk on the Safe Harbor petroglyphs, so that should be pretty interesting. Third Wednesday of the month. And that's it for now. So thanks so much for your time, and it was great to hear from you. Take
You're
care,
welcome.
everyone.
Thanks for the invitation.